Welcome back to the Humble Healer podcast. And today will be the last episode before I go on vacation. And we'll resume podcasting on Tuesday, January the 20th. Thank you for tuning in. And today I will continue with part 2 of the Opioid Use Disorder series and continue on the history and epidemiology of this uniquely American opioid epidemic that has done a lot of damage and has devastating effect on the American youth. So let's go back to some numbers on the U.S. opioid epidemic. In the early 1990s, opioid prescription began to rise, with U.S. painkiller prescription tripling between 1991 and 2011, laying groundwork for addiction. In late 1990s to early 2000s, a sharp increase in opioid-related overdose deaths began, with prescription opioids were heavily implicated. 2010, death continued to climb with opioid prescription and illicit, causing nearly 841,000 deaths from 1999 to 2020, and 500,000 attributed to opioid in that period alone. Mid to late 2010s, fentanyl emergence as a potent illicit opioid fueled a massive surge in fatalities. 70,237 overdose deaths in 2017, and 47,600 involving opioids. In recent years, from 2020 to present, the crisis intensified with over 109,600 total drug overdose deaths in the year ending January 2023, a rate of 300 per day, with opioids remaining a primary driver. So far, from 1999 to 2021, approximately 645,000 Americans died from opioid use. So back to, I adapted and got most of my information for this episode from a book called Dreamland, The True Tale of the American Opioid Epidemic, and continue with the history of the opioid, the rise of the opioid epidemics in America. And the last time we talked about how OxyContin was a tiny pill that had a huge role in the rise of the opioid epidemic in America. Now we continue with another big factor, which is a tiny Mexican village of Jalisco that had a huge impact on millions of American lives. So while oxycodone was used on the rise in the Rust Belt in the 1980s, migrants from Jalisco, a small Mexican village, started selling black tar heroin in San Fernando Valley in the early 1980s. And they went by the name of Jalisco Boys, and then quickly met with success. Their business strategy was different from other large heroin dealers. Instead of selling their product wholesale, they sold it retail. And selling wholesale involves cutting the heroin each time it is sold, thereby reducing its potency. Before the arrival of the Jalisco Boys, the powder heroin sold on the streets were very weak, often containing as little as 1% heroin. Black tar heroin was different. It began live as poppies growing in the hills near Jalisco, and they were harvested by one member of the family, then refined into heroin by another. A third ran the cells that sold the heroin. The result was that heroin arrived on the street at full potency. The Jalisco Boys were also innovative in another way. Their system operated similarly to franchises. The manufactured heroin was sent north to wholesaler, who then supplied small, organized cells. Each cell is comprised of an owner, usually based in Jalisco, as well as a manager, phone operator, and some drivers. The operator took calls from addicts and told them where to meet the driver, who they also kept in the loop. The drivers drove around all day, their mouths stuffed with tiny balloons. Each has a single dose of heroin containing within. When a driver met an addict, they spat out the necessary number of balloons and were gone in minutes. If stopped by the police, the drivers would simply swallow the balloons. The clever part was that the driver would pay a steady salary, independent of the amount of product shifted, so they had no incentive to rip the addicts off or start cutting the heroin. It was a business model, and a seller started out earning $5,000 a day could make an incredible $15,000 a day within just 1 year. To better understand about the influence of the Jalisco Boys' operation in American opioid epidemic, it's important to understand the role of methadone clinics in this epidemic. So, in 1947, methadone was invented, and it was special because, although an opiate, it did not result in addicts constantly having to increase their dosage over time. It was therefore seen as a way that addicts could be treated. They could be supplied with regular amount of methadone on a periodic basis to stop their addiction from becoming worse. Based on this principle, methadone clinics were founded. They provided an effective way of treating addicts also. However, Over time, the idea took hold that methadone should be used to wean addicts off heroin completely, and consequently, clinics began to reduce the amount of methadone they supplied to each addict. The results were inevitable. Because these clinics weren't giving their patient enough opiates, the population of addicts began to search for other means by which they could satisfy their addiction. This is where the Zalisco boys come in. It was thanks to dissatisfied addicts coming out of these methadone clinics that they were able to expand across the San Fernando Valley in the 1990s. Drivers showed up at clinics and handed out free samples of heroin to addicts, along with phone number they could call to get more. The clinics gave Zalisco boys access to a new market they hadn't yet tapped. There was also training for new drivers. They were taught to loiter near clinics around looking for addicts. They came in close when they spotted one and asked for directions. At that moment, they would spit out a few balloons of heroin and thrust the phone number into the addict's hands. This is how the Zalisco boys built up their client base. By the late 90s, the Zalisco boys were the undisputed drug kings in many cities. From the Central City Concern, a nonprofit organization running detox center in Portland in the mid-1990s, 5 to 10% of the patients on their books were there to detox from opiates. But when the Zalisco boys showed up, everything changed. By 1997, the heroin addicts made up 50% of the clinic's patients, and almost all of them had become initially hooked on Zalisco dope. It took until 1999 for Portland officials to finally notice that they had an epidemic on their hands. And if you want to run a good business, you got to keep your customers happy, and you've got to ensure that it's convenient to buy your product. And that's what the Zalisco boys knew this well. And it was this approach that set them apart from other dealers. Also, they were very adept at marketing their product to an important demographic, middle-class white kids. The Zalisco boy didn't just hang around street corner waiting for their customers to show up like other heroin dealers. They frequently approached potential new customers with free sample. The Zalisco boy even make follow-up calls to good clients. Were they satisfied with the service and product they were receiving? They monitor regular customers for signs they might quit, and went so far as to give going-away present of free heroin for customers who said they were checking into rehab. Recently released prisoner sometimes given packs of dope when they got out of prison to get them hooked and come back to the Zalisco boys for more. They also did not carry gun, were almost never violent, and didn't have much heroin on their person at any one time. Because of this, they were arrested and convicted. The punishment weren't very harsh. Maybe a bit of jail time or at worst deportation. It was a good deal, and it meant that there was always a steady supply of Zalisco youth eager to leave home to earn a lot of cash at relatively low risk. They even enlisted addicts to help them push into a new business, for bringing in new customers on providing information about new market, and they were given products for free. By the late 1990s, the network of Zalisco boys had become monstrous, and the authorities realized that something had to be done. On June 15, 2000, the FBI and DEA launched Operation Tar Pit. In terms of geographic spread, it was the largest drug investigation in the country's history. They were bust in 27 cities and across 22 states. However, despite the numbers, the operation caused more problems than it solved because the arrest did not get rid of the addicts. Consequently, there was still plenty of demand for dealers. In the vacuum left behind by the Zalisco bust, competition between new suppliers, lower prices, and actually increased the supply of black tar heroin across the U.S. So get back to the pain revolution. By the 2000, the trajectory of the pain revolution was plain for all to see. Opiates had emerged as the victors. Now, most of the U.S. 100 million chronic pain sufferers were receiving them. The country was consuming 86% of the world oxycodone, as well as 99% of its hydrocodone, another popular opiate. In fact, hydrocodone has since become the U.S. most prescribed individual drug. There are currently 136 million prescriptions for hydrocodone-related drugs each year, while opiate painkillers are the most prescribed class of drugs. And there were knock-on effects to these prescriptions too. As more opiates were prescribed, more people began to use them recreationally. Between 2002 and 2011, 25 million Americans took prescription pills in a manner for which they weren't intended. On top of that, users were getting younger. In 2004, a study conducted by Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration showed that 2.4 million people 12 or older had tried prescription pills non-medically for the first time within the previous year. That's more than the number trying marijuana for the first time, who are on average 22 years old. But the really shocking statistic in this, a decade after the release of OxyContin, 6.1 million people in the U.S. had abused it. That's around 2.4% of the country's entire population. Now, addiction to opiate painkiller isn't a new thing. Drugs like Lortab and Vicodin have been used by addicts for years, but their doses were generally weak, and the pills contain substances like acetaminophen, which limited the potential for abuse. Consequently, abusers rarely die from taking these pills. OxyContin is different. It contains much higher dose and lacks those addiction suppressing chemical. And as for that special time-release coating, addicts soon found they could remove it by sucking on the pills. This meant that pure oxycodone could be easily snorted or injected. Additionally, patients who were requesting higher dose of blood type of Vicodin without being prescribed oxy instead. This meant the potential for abuse was much higher, as oxy contained much higher doses. Many users went from orally taking prescribed pill to IV as a way to up their highs. And of course, once they got used to needles, it was all too easy for them to turn to the far cheaper substance of heroin and fentanyl and became serious addicts. The number of heroin users in the US rose from 373,000 in 2007 to 620,000 4 years later. Of these, 80% have begun by using prescription painkillers. What's more, the statistic painted a clear picture. The number of painkillers prescribed directly correlated with overdose death. Both had risen by over 200% between 1999 and 2008. It was hardly tendentious either. The correlation was staggeringly high at 97.9%. So what have we done to counter the opioid epidemic? It was becoming increasingly clear that the only way to stop the opiate crisis was to get to the source of the matter. There was no point rearranging the deck chairs. Something big had to be done. An attorney, John Brownlee, was among the first to attempt to face down the opioid epidemic. He had become a U.S. attorney in 2001, at a time when people across Ohio, Kentucky, and Virginia were dying of overdoses. He began by doing what many other prosecutors were doing, by prosecuting the pill mill doctors. At first followed their lead, but then when it was clearly going nowhere, he reassessed the situation and realized there was no way around it. He had to set sights on Purdue Pharmaceutical. He subpoenaed all records related to the marketing of OxyContin, and the records showed that Purdue had been actively misleading in their marketing. They were claiming that OxyContin was non-addictive, and they were doing it in all 50 states. By fall 2006, Brownlee was ready and filed a case accusing Purdue of criminal misbranding. He was able to show that despite Purdue claiming their ads, they had in fact supplied no evidence to the FDA showing that OxyContin was less addictive than other painkillers. It was also demonstrated that the company had been teaching sales reps to claim OxyContin was harder to abuse than other drugs, even though Purdue's own research did not show that to be true at all. On top of that, the reps had been told to say that patients who were using up to 60 milligrams of OxyContin had the ability to stop at any point without suffering withdrawal symptoms. In fact, 2001, company studies showed this not to be the case at all, and it was hidden from the public. It was a strong case against, and Purdue ultimately pled guilty to the charge of criminal misbranding. Purdue agreed to pay $634.5 million fine to avoid prison sentences for its executives. Three of whom had pled guilty. Each was sentenced to 3 years of probation and 400 hours of community service. What about the victims? Only a handful of parents group had formed with the mission of raising public awareness for the issue. Oxy and shot. Joanne Cron was one of the such parents. Her son had been high on oxy and shot himself in the head while messing around with a gun. It was while she was still sitting in her comatose son's bedside for his last few hours of life that Cron decided she had to speak out. If she were honest and truthful and really pushed the issue, then maybe another family wouldn't have to go through this pain. She formed a group called Solace, a group of parents mourning the loss of their children to opiates. She also started giving talks at school in which she detailed her son's death. Soon Solace had chapters in 16 counties. Cron's method isn't the only way to fight the epidemic. Brett Belcher found a particularly creative method. He had been sober for 5 years and was tired of the fact that everyone was ignoring the heroin problem in his hometown of Marion, Ohio. So one evening he ordered 500 large signs and printed on each was, "Heroin is Marion's economy." Late one night, he started hanging them up all around Marion, but he was caught by the city authorities when he got downtown. By morning, only 8 of the signs remained. The rest had been taken down. However, a local drug dealer had seen one of the signs, took a photo of it and posted it online, and it went viral. Consequently, the town realized it had to act. The death of one celebrity in particular focused on the minds of many. On Super Bowl Sunday 2014, beloved actor Philip Seymour Hoffman died unexpectedly with a syringe in his arm. In the days of grief that followed, media outlets around the country seemed to all suddenly and simultaneously grasp that the country had an opioid epidemic. Some 15 years after it first began, 2 days after the start of the pain revolution, the tide finally began to turn, and a new consensus had formed as a result. Opiates should no longer be seen as necessary in combating pain. In fact, they can be considered risky at best. Up to 24% of patients were reporting aberrant usage, according to one 2007 study. Purdue eventually acted too, but it was a little too late. In 2010, the company added a new ingredient to OxyContin, an abuse deterrent that made it harder to inject and abuse. If they had done this in 1996, as their study have shown, then the story might have been very different indeed. The FDA began requiring drug companies to educate doctor and patient about the risk of addiction for time-release painkillers. Again, this action was taken later than it should have been. All the while, OxyContin sales continued to rise, produced were made, netting an incredible $3 billion from sales of the drug each year. Back in Scioto County, in the last year of their operation, before they were officially banned in Ohio, pill mills there legally prescribed 0.7 million pills. The county only has 80,000 people in it. Unfortunately, even after the pill mill had been closed for 2 years, Dr. was still prescribing 7 million pills in the county each year. It's not all bad news, as the pain revolution is coming to its close. They are signing that from the record of addiction, recovery is possible. Portsmouth is one of the towns that showed the way. As a former addict ditched their drugs, they went on a lookout for better quality of life, and gyms began to open up, and former addicts even started setting up counseling centers to help others escape the grip of opioid addiction. People started to see former addicts in a new light, face fewer prejudice than before, and found it easier to find work. Now people from all over the Rust Belt travel to Portsmouth to break their addiction cycle and get clean. In a complete turnaround, a real sense of community is growing in what was once a forgotten town. This part of the American Rust Belt is quietly rejuvenating itself. In the next few episodes of Opioid Use Disorder, we'll start getting into the clinical aspect of this disorder, how to recognize the signs and symptoms of opioid addicts, and also treatment for these patients. I hope you find this helpful and interesting, as I did, about this uniquely American opioid epidemic due to our culture, corporation, pharmaceutical companies. And please leave feedback, comment, and let me know that if you know anyone that's struggling with this issue, and any question, where to go. Take care.